October 17, 1973, a Wednesday morning. Americans woke up to find that the world had quietly rewritten the rules overnight. No invasion, no declaration of war. Just a telegram from a cartel most people had never heard of, announcing they were turning off the tap. Within weeks, the most powerful economy on Earth was on its knees. Gas stations ran dry. Factories went dark. The president went on television to ask Americans to turn down their thermostats and cancel Christmas lights. The dollar, which had dominated global finance for nearly 3 decades, began to crack. And the strangest part, almost no one saw it coming. This is the story of how 11 men in a hotel room in Kuwait broke the American century. How a resource America barely thought about became a weapon that revealed just how fragile prosperity really was. And how a crisis that was supposed to last weeks fundamentally restructured the global economy in ways we were still living with today. Because what happened in 1973 wasn't just about oil. It was about the moment America learned it was no longer in control. Let's rewind to understand what made this possible. For most of the 20th century, oil was cheap, absurdly cheap. In 1960, a barrel of crude cost about $3. Adjusted for inflation, that's maybe $25 in today's money. Gasoline was so affordable that Americans didn't think twice about it. They bought bigger cars, moved to suburbs, farther from work, built highways instead of trains. The entire architecture of American life was designed around the assumption that fuel would always be abundant and inexpensive. And why wouldn't it be? America had oil. Texas, Oklahoma, California, all gushing with crude. For decades, the US was the world's largest producer. The country that put the world on wheels was pumping its own gas. But by the late 1960s, something had shifted. American oil production peaked in 1970 and started to decline. Not collapse, just decline. The wells were aging. The easy oil was gone. And demand kept climbing. More cars, more highways, more consumption. So America started importing. Not much at first. Just enough to cover the gap. By 1973, about 35% of the oil flowing through American refineries came from abroad. The Middle East, Venezuela, Canada, still 35% didn't feel catastrophic. It felt manageable. The markets were stable. Prices were low. Everything seemed fine. Except for one uncomfortable fact. The countries that controlled most of the world's oil reserves had been watching. And they were done playing by the old rules. The old rules were simple. Western oil companies, mostly American and British, controlled the infrastructure. They owned the refineries, the pipelines, the tankers. They negotiated contracts with Middle Eastern governments that were extraordinarily favorable. The companies set the prices. The host countries got royalties, but they didn't control the product. It was colonialism in a business suit. Then, in 1960, 5 countries, Iran, Iraq, Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela, formed a cartel. OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. Their goal was coordination. If they acted together, they could push back against the oil majors, negotiate better terms, reclaim sovereignty over their own resources. For over a decade, OPEC was mostly symbolic. The oil companies still called the shots. Prices stayed low. The cartel met, issued statements, and didn't change much. But by the early 1970s, the balance of power had shifted. Countries like Libya and Algeria had fully nationalized their oil industries. Saudi Arabia was negotiating for majority control of Aramco, the company that held the keys to the world's largest oil reserves. The producers were no longer asking permission. They were taking control. And then the geopolitics caught fire. October 6, 1973, Yom Kippur, the holiest day in the Jewish calendar. Egypt and Syria launched a surprise attack on Israel, hoping to reclaim territory lost in the Six-Day War 6 years earlier. The war was brutal and fast-moving. Israel, caught off guard, was on the defensive. Within days, the situation looked dire. Then, the United States stepped in. President Nixon authorized Operation Nickel Grass, a massive airlift of weapons, ammunition, and supplies to Israel. American cargo planes flew round-the-clock missions. Tanks, missiles, artillery, anything Israel needed to hold the line. The tide turned. Israel pushed back. The war stabilized, but the Arab members of OPEC were watching, and they were furious. For years, the US had played both sides. Friendly with Saudi Arabia, protective of Israel. It was a delicate balance, but the airlift shattered any illusion of neutrality. From the perspective of Arab oil producers, America had chosen a side, and that side was actively fighting against Arab nations. So on October 17, 1973, 11 days into the war, the Arab members of OPEC met in Kuwait City. They made two decisions. First, they would cut oil production by 5% immediately, with additional cuts every month until Israel withdrew from occupied territories and Palestinian rights were recognized. Second, they would impose a total embargo on countries that supported Israel. The United States, the Netherlands, Portugal, no oil, period. The announcement was calm, almost bureaucratic, but the implications were seismic. America had just been cut off from 35% of its oil supply. Overnight, at first, the response was almost dismissive. Politicians downplayed it. Experts said it wouldn't last. The general assumption was that the embargo was a bluff. The Arab states needed to sell oil just as much as America needed to buy it. Markets would adjust. Alternatives would emerge. They were wrong. By November, the effects were undeniable. Gas stations across the country started running out of fuel. Lines stretched for blocks. People waited for hours, sometimes only to find the pumps empty. Fistfights broke out. Some stations started rationing. Odd-even systems based on license plates, ten-gallon limits, cash only. The price of gasoline nearly quadrupled. What had been 30 cents a gallon in early 1973 hit over $1 by early 1974. Doesn't sound like much now, but in real terms, it was a shock. Imagine if gas went from $3 to $12 in 6 months. People panicked. They hoarded, they siphoned, theft spiked, but the gas lines were just the visible symptom. The real damage was happening deeper in the economy. Oil is everywhere, not just in your gas tank. It's in plastics, fertilizers, synthetic fabrics, pharmaceuticals, jet fuel, heating oil, asphalt. It's the feedstock for modern industrial civilization. When oil prices quadruple, everything gets more expensive. Shipping costs surge. Manufacturing slows. Farmers pay more for diesel and fertilizer, so food prices climb. Airlines cut routes. Heating bills explode just as winter sets in. And then the second-order effects kick in. Factories lay off workers because demand drops. Unemployment rises. Consumer spending falls. Businesses that depend on cheap energy, trucking, airlines, chemicals, start bleeding money. Some go under. By 1974, the US economy was in freefall. GDP contracted. Unemployment hit 9%. Inflation, already a problem before the embargo, spiraled into double digits. Economists didn't have a word for what was happening. Recessions were supposed to come with low inflation. Booms came with high inflation. But now, the economy was shrinking, and prices were exploding at the same time. They invented a term, stagflation. It was unprecedented, and there was no playbook for how to fix it. The Nixon administration scrambled. They tried price controls. They didn't work. They lowered speed limits to 55 miles per hour to conserve fuel. They pushed daylight saving time year-round to reduce heating costs. They asked Americans to carpool, to drive less, to turn down thermostats. Nixon went on television in November 1973 and announced Project Independence. The goal was ambitious. Energy self-sufficiency by 1980, no more reliance on foreign oil. America would drill more, build nuclear plants, invest in coal, develop alternatives. It was a fantasy. There was no way to replace Middle Eastern oil that quickly. The infrastructure didn't exist. The technology wasn't ready. And even if it were, it would take a decade to build. Meanwhile, the embargo dragged on. Months passed. The oil kept not flowing. By early 1974, the political pressure was immense. Some voices in Washington floated the idea of military intervention, seizing the oil fields, forcing the embargo to end. Secretary of State Henry Kissinger hinted at it in interviews, carefully ambiguous but unmistakably threatening. It never happened. The logistics were impossible. The diplomatic fallout would have been catastrophic, and the Soviets, who had backed Egypt and Syria during the war, would have responded. So America waited and negotiated, and bled economically. The embargo officially ended in March 1974, 5 months after it began. Israel hadn't withdrawn from occupied territories. Palestinian rights weren't recognized. The stated goals of the embargo weren't achieved. But OPEC had won anyway, because the embargo wasn't really about Israel. It was about power. It was about proving that the producers, not the consumers, controlled the supply, that oil could be weaponized, that the old colonial arrangements were over, and it worked. Oil prices never went back down. Before the embargo, crude was $3 a barrel. After the embargo, it stabilized around $12. By the end of the 1970s, after the Iranian Revolution, it would hit $40. The cheap energy era was over. The long-term consequences were staggering. First, the American economy was permanently scarred. The 1970s became synonymous with malaise. High inflation, high unemployment, stagnant wages, declining industrial power. The post-war boom was over. The sense of limitless growth evaporated. Second, the global financial system buckled. Oil-exporting countries were suddenly flooded with cash. Hundreds of billions of dollars that needed somewhere to go. Much of it flowed into Western banks, which then loaned it to developing countries. This would later trigger the debt crises of the 1980s. Third, the geopolitical map shifted. The Middle East became the center of global energy security. America deepened its military presence in the region. The Carter Doctrine in 1980 declared that any threat to the Persian Gulf would be met with military force. That doctrine is still in effect. It's why the US has bases in Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait, and why the Fifth Fleet patrols the Strait of Hormuz. Fourth, America started building a strategic petroleum reserve. Massive underground caverns filled with hundreds of millions of barrels of crude, a buffer against future shocks. It's still there, still being used. And fifth, the crisis accelerated the search for alternatives. Nuclear power, coal, natural gas, eventually, decades later, fracking, the shale revolution that made America the world's largest oil producer again by 2018 has its roots in the trauma of 1973. But here's the uncomfortable truth beneath all of this. The embargo worked because America had built an economy that couldn't function without cheap oil. The suburbs, the highways, the cars, the sprawl, all of it assumed fuel would always be abundant. When that assumption broke, the entire system seized up, and the response wasn't to rethink the system. It was to secure more oil, to make sure the supply never got cut off again. America didn't learn to use less. It learned to control more. Every war in the Middle East since 1973, the Gulf War, the Iraq War, the endless interventions and proxy conflicts, carries the echo of that embargo. The lesson Washington took from 1973 wasn't energy independence. It was never let it happen again. Even now, 50 years later, oil remains the lever that moves the world. Prices spike, economies shudder. Supplies tighten, tensions flare. We've added solar panels and electric cars, but the fundamental dependency hasn't disappeared. It's just been redistributed. So, here's the question that lingers. In 1973, a handful of countries realized they had a resource the world couldn't live without. They used it as a weapon. It worked. Today, the resources are different. Rare earth minerals, semiconductors, lithium, data. The levers have changed. But the game is the same. Who holds them now? And what happens when they decide to pull?